Welcome again to Early Latin Morphosyntax. This is now the last segment of this before we can move on to a sample text. We have now seen how finite subordinate clauses work in Latin. In addition, there are non-finite ones. The most common ones are called accusative and participle and accusative and infinitive constructions. They have English equivalents. You can see them here on my handout. I saw him coming, where we have a participle. I saw him come with a shortened infinitive without to, and I believe him to be clever with a full infinitive with a to. Both types are quite common in English after verbs like to see, with the form in ing. The meaning is typically that of physical perception. I saw him coming with my eyes. With the infinitive, the meaning can be that of physical perception again, but there can also be one of non-visual cognition. I saw him come can also contain to see in its meaning to understand and to grasp. Both constructions exist in Latin as well, with the same broad meanings. So here we can see, sed quid currentem servum apportu conspicor, but why do I see my slave running with a participle, present participle, from the harbour? And we have a verb of seeing, conspicor. And in my next example, video, I can see, again a verb of seeing, recipere se senem, with an infinitive. Now in Latin, the construction is more versatile and it's used after a wider range of verbs. So we can also find it with verbs like to believe, credo, I believe, edebol equidem, dormire solem, that the sun is sleeping. And by sun I mean the sun above in the sky. So it's a long night and I believe the sun is sleeping. Now let's begin with the second issue I mentioned. In the accusative and infinitive construction, the subject of the non-finite verb stands in the accusative and the verb is in the infinitive. The construction is found after verbs of speech, verbs of cognition and verbs of emotion. In English, the construction is attested only with a subset of these verbs, and what is more, after verbs like to believe, it arose from Latin influence. Turning to the second issue, we can say that the construction is more versatile because Latin has more infinitive types. Infinitives can be active or passive and can be perfect, present or future. So here's an example. We have perfect, active amavisse, passive amatum esse. We have present amare and present passive amari. And we have future amaturum esse and amatum iri. And when you look at these future passive infinitives, it's actually quite different from perfect passive and future active, because this bit is a supine, which Beppe has already mentioned at some point in morphology, while this here and this here is not a supine, and you can inflect. You can have amatum esse, amatam esse, amatos esse, and so on, or similarly amaturum esse, amaturam esse, and so on. Now, when I say perfect, present and future infinitives, I'm using traditional terminology. It doesn't mean that a perfect infinitive necessarily corresponds to a finite perfect. Essentially, infinitives only have relative tense. The perfect infinitive is anterior to a finite verb, the present infinitive is simultaneous, and the future infinitive is posterior. So the absolute time reference of such an accusative and infinitive construction has to be computed, as it were, from the tense meaning of the finite verb in combination with that of the infinitive. Now, Latin is closely related to Oscan and Umbrian, and as far as we can tell from the remains of Oscan and Umbrian, they had a simpler system of infinitives, and even those formations, which correspond to Latin ones, semantically do not necessarily match morphologically. For example, Latin present active infinitives end in se, as in esse, or in re after vowel, as in amare, while in Oscan and Umbrian these infinitives end in om. The Latin form continues a locative of an s stem, verbal noun. The Osco-Umbrian form continues an accusative. Now, what that means in practical terms for our purposes is that Proto-Italic, the ancestor of Latin, Oscan and Umbrian, did not yet have fully grammaticalized infinitives, and that Latin future infinitives, for example, are an innovation. In early Latin, tense usage in the accusative and infinitive construction is still quite distinct from classical usage. All tenses and voices of the infinitive are attested, but the future infinitive is not yet used as commonly as in the classical period. Instead, the present infinitive can often be used with future function. And I have a nice example here from Plautus. In a single line, in the Mostellaria, we find both constructions side by side. So we have one speaker saying dicte daturum ud abeat, and here we have dic, say that you are going to give, so dic imperative, followed by te, accusative, and daturum, a future infinitive. You can see esse doesn't have to be expressed every single time, but the main point is we have a future form here. So say that you are going to give money, ud abeat, so that he goes away. And that is followed by an echo question. Are you being serious? I should say that I'm going to give him money. Egon dicam. I should say, again a verb of speech, same verb of speech in fact, but followed simply by a present infinitive. And this present infinitive here has future function. So what that means is that before the creation of future infinitives proper, the present infinitive was really a non-past infinitive, and early Latin preserves that situation to some extent. Now, that alternation between present and future infinitives is not random. It's driven by semantic factors, in fact by telicity. And I should explain. An event is telic if it has a linguistically specified endpoint. If there is no such endpoint, it is atelic. So to run a mile is telic because an endpoint is specified, but to sleep is atelic. Obviously we don't sleep forever, so there's an endpoint of some sort, but it's not specified linguistically, and that's what's important here. And sometimes you can test quite simply. You can have an interruption test. For example, if you have telic to run home, where an endpoint is specified. Here we have the endpoint, and you say John is running home. You can test and see if it's telic or not by saying John stopped running home. And if you stop a telic event, it hasn't reached its endpoint, and that means John hasn't reached home. He hasn't reached home. Now, if we take atelic running, John is running, atelic, no endpoint specified, and I interrupt him, we can say John stopped running, and the logical conclusion is he has already run. Now, the distribution of infinitives in Latin follows a pattern dependent on telicity. If we have present meaning, only present infinitives can be used. I mean, that is pretty obvious. If there is future meaning, things are more complicated. If we are dealing with an atelic event, the future infinitive, is more or less obligatory. But if it's telic, both future infinitive and present infinitive with future meaning co-occur. The reason for that distribution pattern is actually quite straightforward. For atelic events, the distinction between present and future meaning is very clear-cut. For telic ones, it's less clear. If I say I'm leaving, I may already be in the process, but it's equally possible that the event is still in the future and that I've only prepared for it mentally. So the difference between present and future is more obvious with atelic events. The present infinitive with future meaning was ousted more quickly here than among telic ones. There's a further complication, especially in early Latin. It's long been observed that subject accusatives can sometimes be left out. This phenomenon has variously been described as a colloquialism or a feature of early Latin. However, it happens not only in early Latin, although especially in early Latin, and it happens in all registers. There's an interesting observation by a Scandinavian scholar, Sjögren, that went largely unnoticed for about a century, and that is that the subject accusative is more commonly left out in the future tense than in the present. But why would that be? If we look at active infinitives, the subject accusative is absent commonly in the future tense, but not in present or perfect. So let us now turn to the passive. In the passive, we do not have enough data for the future. Future passive infinitives are relatively rare. However, in the present, the subject accusative is normally used, and in the perfect passive, it's absent more often. So we can say that the subject accusatives are left out most commonly in future active and perfect passive, two tenses which have very little in common semantically. One is active, one is passive, one is future, one is perfect. So why do we have such an odd pattern? Well, the answer is that the two tenses don't have a shared meaning, but they have shared morphology. Both are formed with participles and sometimes the verb to be. None of the other infinitives is formed this way, and participles are marked for case, gender, and number. Now the case, of course, has to be accusative, but gender and number depend on the subject accusative. Since the participle allows us to retrieve gender and number of the subject, it's easier to leave out the subject accusative without becoming unclear. And that is the reason why we find ellipses of subject accusatives more commonly with future active and perfect passive than with the other tenses. We have now finished the morphosyntactic segment, and it's high time to move on to a sample text. So many thanks for listening to so much about syntax, and thank you very much. Gratias vobis ago.